The Middle East and North Africa account for a large share of the world's petroleum production and exports. But despite the region's natural wealth, years of conflict and turmoil have triggered many political and economic challenges. From the Arab Spring to civil war in Syria, Iraq, Libya and Yemen, and from the fragile economies of Jordan, Lebanon and Tunisia to the COVID-19 pandemic. A countless number of lives have been lost, millions of people displaced, and infrastructure damaged. Then there are the ever-changing political dynamics, endemic corruption, the effects of oil price fluctuation, and the transition from fossil fuels to green economies. So is there hope for the economies in the MENA region, and how can they find a way forward? We'll find out more as the World Bank Vice President for the Middle East and North Africa, Ferid Belhaj, talks to Al Jazeera. Ferid Belhaj, Vice President of the World Bank for the Middle East, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Sami.
It's been a busy year, if not a busy decade for this region, hasn't it? After, well, we've had the Arab Spring, the fall in oil prices, then the pandemic. Is the Middle East now at an economic turning point?
The state of affairs in the Middle East is not good. This is for sure. You mentioned the Arab Spring and 10 years of hope and disillusionment, unfortunately. And today, with this dual crisis of the pandemic, the fall of the oil prices, a large number of countries in the Middle East are facing a very difficult economic and social situation. Just see what's happening as we speak, for instance, in the birthplace of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. So things are not looking great. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is gloom and doom. There is clearly there are opportunities possibly to look at a brighter future. But for that, there will be a very, very strong and deep need for deep reforms. And I guess this is really the crux of the matter. There is a need for all of these countries, from Morocco all the way to the Gulf countries, to look at the future through a totally new comprehension of the role of the state in the economy. And I guess this is what this whole conversation should be about. How can we look at a decade, the next decade, that would not be yet another lost decade for the people of the Middle East and of North Africa?
That's exactly what we want this conversation to be about. And to get there, though, we've got to look at some of the warnings out there. I remember reading a report from the United Nations published in July last year. It estimated that the economy of the Arab region was actually going to contract by 5.7%. Have governments done enough since July 2020 to avoid that kind of scenario? Have they made the kind of adjustments that you're talking about?
Not sure. Frankly, not sure. The 5.7% is more for the oil exporting countries. In general, for the oil importing countries, the contraction was, about 2.2%. It is still, big, and it's still a problem. Now, how can these countries look at, going about reforms when, their economies are under a lot of stress? Well, there is what we call no regret reforms. There are reforms that are not necessarily costing much, but that can actually bring about a very, very important turnaround. I'm talking about good governance. I'm talking about transparency, whether it is in the way you go about the business of government or the issues are related to, for instance, debt transparency, budget transparency, making sure that those who are interested in investing in those countries, have a very clear path forward.
We're not seeing that kind of adjustment in transparency, better governance, all the things that international organizations said, hey, you in the region need to take care of this, better respect for human rights and democracy. It almost seems like we're going in the opposite way, doesn't it?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, we are still a long path away from getting to where we are getting. That's why we are advocating for an immediate taking care immediately of this dimension, for immediately opening up the books and opening up the economies and getting the private sector to play the role that is the role of the private sector, that is creating jobs, that is taking risks for high rewards. And that, you're absolutely right. We're not seeing it, but there are a few pockets where there is some hope. I look at Morocco, for instance, with all of its issues and problems, notably on the social side. Morocco is moving ahead on reforms, moving ahead on opening up the economy, moving ahead in anchoring its economy in the broader region, whether it is vis-à-vis Europe or vis-à-vis sub-Saharan Africa. I'm looking at Egypt. Egypt has done a lot over the last 3, 4, 5 years in terms of looking at the macro framework. They have done a lot in terms of introducing the VAT. They have floated their currency. They have worked a lot on adjusting the subsidy schemes. But that's not enough. There is a need for what I would call the new generation of reforms when it comes to Egypt. But unfortunately, and you contrast that with other countries. I'm talking about Tunisia, I'm talking about Iraq, I'm talking about, unfortunately, the sorest point in my view in MENA, that is Lebanon. A country that is going about its business with self-inflicted wounds. So in all of these countries, unfortunately, we are not seeing the reforms that are needed, and we need to keep pressing, because this is really something that needs to be done yesterday. And this is something that is not today being done. So having this conversation with you, hopefully we'll get the message through.
Yeah, but I'm glad you mentioned Lebanon and Tunisia there. I mean, poverty rates in those countries, 45% and 20% respectively. How likely is the possibility of collapse?
Well, look, those numbers are flabbergasting. For people who know Lebanon, who lived in Lebanon, who love Lebanon, seeing almost half of the population falling under the dignity threshold of poverty is really amazing. And this is really, yes, Lebanon has gone through difficulties. They have, gone through the Syria crisis, the refugees. They have a lot of geopolitical issues, but the majority, the bulk of the issues are self-inflicted. The majority of the issues have to do with their governance system, with the corrupt system, and with the fact that in terms of the economy, we are looking at a broad rent-seeking class of politicians that are not advancing the interests of Lebanon. When it comes to Tunisia, the same thing. Remember, Tunisia about 15 years ago was seen as one of the examples in terms of stability, in terms of growth, and in terms of social cohesion. But what all of us, did not see were the underlying currents that were basically telling us that things were not as strong and as resilient as we thought they were. So now today we are looking at two countries that have traditions of openness, tradition of secularism, tradition of some kind of democratic culture. Well, those two countries are now falling apart to a large extent. And this is again where we need to launch this shout, for the governance in these countries to wake up and really to move ahead with opening up their economies and again, going about these no regret reforms. These are reforms that cost nothing in terms of the budget, but these are high reward reforms.
All right. The UN also estimated in that report that the ranks of the poor were going to rise by 14 million to reach a quarter of the Arab population. Is that where we are heading now? And what will that mean for the region when a quarter of the population is in the ranks of poverty?
No, it is a terrible state of affairs. You need to add to all of the issues related to corruption and lack of transparency, the instability that is unfortunately becoming inherent to the Middle East and North Africa. If you look across from Libya to Syria to Iraq, Lebanon, of course, to Yemen, instability, violence, civil war even are becoming unfortunately kind of a common denominator for a large number of these countries. So look at Yemen. Yemen today is threatened by yet another, if I may say, round of famine. Poverty is rampant and people are in a desperate situation. Well, if you look at what's happening on the ground, what's happening is wars and factions fighting each other. and the victims are the poor people, the kids, the elderly, the women in Yemen.
It's scary, Fareed. So what I'm curious to know is when you look at the list of countries that fall under your responsibility to assist, how many on those list of countries can you say, you know, this is a region that's gone through an Arab Spring, supposedly to address some of the issues you mentioned there of transparency, corruption, strengthening democracy, empowering local authorities. How many of those countries have been prompted by the pandemic now to address some of these long-standing structural challenges to development? Are there any?
I would say that, you know, the two countries that have gone through this crisis in somewhat balanced way are the countries I mentioned earlier. That is Morocco and Egypt. Now, of course, you have the Gulf countries, and those countries have deep pockets, so they are able to put money in terms of managing their, the social safety nets that are very, very important to make sure that you absorb, the impact of the COVID crisis.
But for how long, Fareed? Because even oil-rich countries are now also hit by the low oil prices on top of the pandemic.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And that's the point I was making at the beginning. Yeah, you're absolutely right. In order to see things kind of spiking back up for the Gulf countries, there is also a link to the oil prices. And there is also a link, frankly, and this is again going back to the, this concept of no regret reforms. There is a need for these countries to diversify their economies. There is a need for these countries to get away from the total full dependency on oil. And this is also something that we are working on with a number of these countries, notably Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others. So again, the point is we are in a difficult situation, but there are windows and doors that could be opened so that, again, we are not facing a new lost decade. Let me give you one number and then we can continue. By 2050, 300 million young people in MENA, in the Middle East and North Africa, will be knocking at the door of the job market. 300 million people, meaning 800,000 new jobs need to be created in MENA every single month. And clearly, the way the economy is going right now, from the Gulf to the ocean, to the Atlantic Ocean, there is absolutely no prospect for these jobs to be created. So we need now, again, to push forward, to change
Fareed, that number, that's supposed to come from the private sector, right? And we're not seeing the level of stability and structural reform to attract the level of investment to create 800,000 jobs a month.
Absolutely right. And this is where we need to push and to tell it as it is. Those 800,000 jobs a month shall not be created by the public sector. It's a private sector engagement. And for that, what do you need? Transparency, you need governance, you need stability, you need an open investment climate. And this is what we don't have now in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is what we are militating for.
Okay, so if this is not happening, and if we kind of divide the countries in the region into two groups, you've got the oil-rich countries and you've got the middle and low-income countries. In terms of the oil-rich ones, what's ultimately going to happen to them if they're not diversifying fast enough? Are they going to drop into the ranks? Are we going to see more countries drop into the ranks of middle income as they become financially stressed? Are we going to see expatriate populations pushed out?
No, look, the good news is that there is a realization in all of the countries in the Gulf that there is a need to diversify. Look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia. I'm looking at what's happening in the UAE and other places. There is a realization, and to a large extent, there is a drive forward. If I look today at the ranking of the UAE or Saudi Arabia in our own way of looking at, the attractiveness of investment, the investment climate, they are doing better. If I look at Saudi Arabia in the way women are now being more involved in the economy, they are doing much better. Granted, coming from a low base, but still they are doing much better. So there is a drive there. And as you know, these things are not instant coffee. They take time. But it's because they take time that we need to start today. So they are doing things there, okay? So I'm not just painting a dark picture, but what I'm saying is that we need to speed up the pace. This is not where we are right now is not good enough, and the Gulf countries are playing a very, very important and crucial role, I would say, in maintaining the stability of the economy of the whole MENA region. Not only because of the attractiveness they have in terms of manpower, but also trading between countries in the MENA region, and notably within the Gulf countries, is an important one.
But I'm glad you said that, though. That's been hit by the pandemic, right? Because of all these shutdowns, because of the general cycle of economic activity. And it's obviously hurt the Gulf countries and the oil-rich ones, but it's hurt the middle-income countries as well, because they're suffering from declines in trade, declines in remittances, and declines in the service sector and tourism, right? I mean, what's going to happen to them?
No, absolutely. You have a great point there. And notably, you mentioned tourism, for instance. This is where, the countries from Morocco to Tunisia to Jordan and others and Egypt are being the hardest hit. What they need to do is really to speed up this whole vaccination campaign. And what they need to do is really to speed up their, opening up again their economy, so that people can feel that there is some kind of a hope in these countries. Now, in terms of vaccination campaign, for instance, we are, as the World Bank, moving very, very, aggressively in helping a large number of these countries finance, their procurement of vaccines. We have put on the table about $12 billion across the board to help countries move ahead with this.
Ferid, is that a blessing but also a burden? I mean, debt is mushrooming, so you're helping some of these countries. You've just green-lighted $246 million in the form of a loan to Lebanon. But do you think Lebanon can ever pay that money back? I mean, given the size of its debt it's already got.
No, that's a good question. You're right, that is skyrocketing in a number of countries, say Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia, and other places. Specifically on your question, of course, Lebanon will be able to repay the debt because our terms of lending are, extremely soft, and they will be repaying over a period of 20 years.
But Ferid, when you've got a debt to GDP ratio, for example, in the case of Lebanon, 151%. I mean, are any terms soft enough? It just looks like some of these countries are facing a mountain of debt they can never climb.
Look, it is true that it is going to be tough. And that's why they need to adjust very fast. This is why they need really to open up and to engage, among other things, into an IMF program that will bring about more discipline in what they are doing on the macro side. And that's why they need to bring about, again, more transparency, more good governance, so that they can attract for an investment, and over the medium and longer term, get into a place where they'll be able to start absorbing this level of debt. But today, a large number of countries will need to run some deficit, unfortunately, because the economy is slowing down, and there is a need to bring about social safety nets in order for those who are the most hardly affected to be able to absorb the shock. And second, they need, one way or the other, to acquire these vaccines. So there is no way around that. So yes, we are going through a difficult time, but that difficult time needs to be managed and mitigated. Again, and I'm sorry,
is there really no way around it?
myself.
What about those who call that there needs to be a debt forgiveness plan? Do you, for example, in the World Bank, have some kind of debt forgiveness plan for some of these countries? I mean, I don't know what you say off camera, but I imagine you must have some serious doubts about some of these countries. You've extended, I think, $43 billion in just the first 6 months of the pandemic to countries around the world. Yeah.
We have these type of plans for the least developed countries, for those who are really, really, the poorest of the poor of the countries, and we have these plans that would allow for them to be able to, move ahead and do what they need to do, again, in terms of social safety nets, in terms of acquisition of medicine, vaccines, etc., and, without necessarily falling under the weight of more debt. But then again, you also need to make sure that those countries who are able, to manage their debt and are putting themselves in this situation because they are not making the necessary efforts. Well, for these countries really to, kind of stand up for themselves and really go about these reforms that would allow them, to be in a situation where they will be able to bring the basic services to their people and bring about more balance.
So is it a matter that you don't want to let
economy.
Some countries off the hook? Because I've heard of the World Bank having programs to restructure or delay or defer the service on debt. Which countries have you decided, hey, we're going to have a debt waiver program to cancel debts? Is it that you don't want to make that kind of, because you think, and it might be justified in some of these countries, there's far too much corruption and they won't take it seriously? I mean, reform seriously?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't necessarily make that direct link there. But as I mentioned earlier, we have these programs for the least developed countries. We don't have that many of those in our region. But yes, you're right. I mean, it is an important drive that we are exploring.
We've seen in the last few years the number of, shall we say, disputes kind of multiplied, even here in the Gulf. Do you think that the transition that's taking place in the US right now, how is that going to impact the sort of security alliances? And I know you're not a politician, but that does impact the economic situation, right? It does impact whether people are going to come here and invest money in this part of the world if they think that everybody's at each other's necks. What is your reading of the sort of political map ahead?
Well, let's say that the first good news for this year was the restoration of ties between the Gulf countries, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. That is a piece of good news, particularly if you look at MENA as the least integrated region economically in the whole world. So, the only bright spot we had was the Gulf Cooperation Council. And I'm very happy to see that these links are being restored. This is important. Now, how are the new political trends coming out of Washington going to affect the region? We shall see. But clearly, what we need is more stability and more predictability in the region's political affairs, because that's really the key to getting economies.
On the point of stability and predictability, did you see any of the fruits that were promised under the Jared Kushner plan for normalization of relations between Arab countries and Israel? Have we seen any of those envisaged fruits, economic fruits of normalization, take place now that we've had a number of Arab countries that have moved in that direction?
Well, I guess look, generally speaking, as I mentioned earlier, a broader, regional cooperation is important, not only within the Arab world, but also in what I would call the hinterland of the Arab world that goes all the way to Europe and to Asia and to Sub-Saharan Africa. So I would say that having that broader, set of cooperation, and you mentioned Israel, but I would mention a number of other countries, is important. Now, the direct link to the plan that was put forward is not evident as yet, I guess. But what's really important here, and the main message, is the need for more regional cooperation and on the economic and trade side. This is where the difference will be made in the coming 5 to 10 years.
All right. Thank you so much, Ferid Belhaj, Vice President of the World Bank for the Middle East, for talking to us. It's been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, Sami.